Ozark Horrors. The air in the Ozarks was thick and humid, a cloying blanket that settled over the 12 staff members of Death Metal Bar. Sid, the perpetually bored manager, grunted as he wrestled with a tent pole. Steph, the bar's social media guru, was already snapping selfies with a filter that made the trees look like they were weeping blood. Alex, the quietest bartender, meticulously organized his fishing gear, while Ryan, the loudest, chugged a cheap beer, his laughter echoing through the dense woods. Mike, the bouncer with a neck like a tree trunk, was trying to start a fire with damp kindling, grumbling under his breath. Rhonda, the sharp-witted server, watched him with an amused smirk, occasionally offering unhelpful advice. Sammy, the newest hire, fiddled nervously with her phone, trying to get a signal, while Colin and Connor, the inseparable dishwashers, were already splashing in the nearby creek. Zach, the resident mixologist, was meticulously arranging a cooler full of artisanal cocktails, completely oblivious to the burgeoning chaos. Jason, the grizzled old cook, sat whittling a stick, his eyes darting around the darkening forest. Tristan, the quietest of the group, was sketching in a small notebook, while Robert, the part-time DJ, was attempting to hook up a portable speaker, the faint sounds of blast beats already annoying everyone. Their team-building retreat, a float trip down a secluded stretch of the current river, had been Sid's idea. Get everyone out of the neon glow of meta-horizons, he'd said. Connect with nature. Forget about spilled PBR and screaming fans for a bit. But as twilight deepened and the shadows stretched long and gnarled between the trees, a different kind of connection seemed to be settling in. One of unease. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from deeper in the woods, silencing Ryan's boisterous laughter. Mike froze, his fire-starting efforts forgotten. Just a branch, Zach offered, a little too brightly, but no one seemed convinced. Jason slowly lowered his whittling knife, his gaze fixed on the tree line. The temperature seemed to drop a few degrees, despite the humidity. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Sammy whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the air, chilling them to the bone. It was Colin. But then, an instant later, Colin emerged from a thicket, red-faced and laughing. "Gotcha! Just a squirrel, tripped right over him." He pointed at a small, chittering creature darting up a tree. Relief, tinged with annoyance, washed over the group. Mike threw a damp stick at him, and Ryan resumed his chugging. As the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, a roaring campfire finally took hold, casting dancing shadows that stretched and contorted like grotesque caricatures. The cooler of Zach's cocktails dwindled, replaced by the clinking of beer bottles. Robert's attempt at a death metal playlist was finally in full swing. The guttural vocals and hammering drums a bizarre counterpoint to the chirping crickets and rustling leaves. Inhibitions, along with good judgment, began to melt away. Then, through the cacophony of metal and drunken chatter, a new sound began to emerge. A high-pitched, guttural cackling, eerily reminiscent of hyenas, but far more sinister. It seemed to come from all directions, weaving through the trees, closing in. The music abruptly cut out as Robert fumbled with his speaker, his face paling. "What the hell was that?" Steph slurred, trying to focus her eyes on the surrounding darkness. Before anyone could answer, shadows detached themselves from the deeper woods, moving with a speed that defied their hulking forms. Crude nets, fashioned from thick vines and tangled rope, flew through the air, expertly snaring the bewildered bar staff. Shouts of confusion turned into cries of terror as they were dragged, kicking and struggling, into the impenetrable blackness of the Ozark night. The last thing they saw before the world went black was the glint of sharpened bone and the gleam of feral, hungry eyes. They were dragged for what felt like an eternity, through thorny undergrowth and over uneven terrain, the cackling never truly fading. Finally, they were unceremoniously dumped into a cavernous, reeking space, the hideaway of their captors. The air was thick with the stench of wood smoke, decay, and something else, something metallic and sickeningly sweet. Torches flickered on the walls, illuminating crude carvings of stick figures being dismembered and a chilling collection of objects. Bones. Lots of bones. The butcher's lair. As their eyes adjusted, a fresh wave of nausea hit them. The hideaway wasn't just a cave, it was a charnel house. The floor was a damp, uneven mix of packed earth and something sticky that glinted in the torchlight. Everywhere they looked, there were remnants. Skulls, some cracked open, others with teeth still attached, were impaled on sharpened sticks like macabre trophies. Rib cages hung from the low ceiling, swaying slightly, resembling grotesque wind chimes. A pile of what looked like human femurs lay haphazardly in one corner, next to a large, crude wooden block stained dark with what could only be dried blood. A guttural grunt echoed through the space, and the flickering light finally revealed their captors. They weren't just men. They were twisted, deformed caricatures of humanity. Their skin was a sickly grey, stretched taut over gaunt frames, and their eyes glowed with an unsettling, predatory intelligence. They wore tattered scraps of what might once have been clothing, but mostly they were adorned with bone fragments, animal pelts, and what looked disturbingly like dried, flayed human skin. One of them, a towering figure with a matted beard and a single milky eye, carried a crude cleaver that dripped slowly onto the dirt floor. Another, smaller and quicker, sported a necklace of what appeared to be dried human ears. Their faces, visible now in the flickering light, were contorted into expressions of ravenous hunger and cruel amusement. The cackling started again, a chorus of guttural, joyous sounds that made the blood run cold. This wasn't some campfire story. This was real, and they were the main course. One by one, the cannibals roughly seized their captives. There was no discussion, no explanation, just brute force. Each staff member was dragged towards a dark corner of the cavern where a makeshift shower awaited. It was a horrifying contraption, a large rusted drum suspended from the ceiling, slowly dripping a thin, brownish liquid onto a grate below. The stench coming from it was worse than anything they'd smelled so far, a vile mix of stagnant water, lye, and something putrid. With chilling efficiency, the cannibals ripped off their victims' clothing, tossing the familiar fabric onto a growing pile of discarded rags. The shock of the cold, foul water, combined with the rough scrubbing hands that seemed intent on flaying their skin, made them gasp and shiver. The barbarians used stiff, crude brushes, their movements less about cleanliness and more about a chilling, ritualistic preparation. Every inch of skin was scoured with a harsh, gritty substance, leaving it raw and tingling. Once cleaned, each trembling individual was handed a coarse, surprisingly soft white robe that smelled faintly of wood smoke and a pair of ill-fitting straw sandals. The significance of the white robes became terrifyingly clear. They weren't just being cleaned, they were being ritually purified, prepared as offerings. They were being stripped of their identities, of their very humanity, and redressed for some unspeakable purpose. Lined up in their new, identical attire, they looked less like people and more like lambs awaiting slaughter. The cannibals circled them, eyes gleaming, their cackling now a low, expectant hum, the grimoire of flesh. Then, a hulking figure, clearly the leader with his scarred face and an unsettlingly ancient gleam in his single good eye, stepped forward. He held something in his gnarled hands. Not a weapon, but a thick, bound book. It looked disturbingly like it was made of tanned human leather, crudely stitched together with what could only be sinew. He extended it towards them, a slow, deliberate movement that held a terrible weight. "Welcome!" A guttural voice rasped, the words surprisingly clear despite the thick accent. "To the feast of the ancestors." He didn't hand the book to any one person in particular, but dropped it onto the damp earth at their feet. The cover was devoid of any title, but embossed into the grisly hide were chilling, stylized depictions of figures being flayed, dismembered, and consumed. Alex, being the closest and perhaps the most outwardly composed, reached out a trembling hand and picked it up. His fingers recoiled from the warmth of the material, a warmth that hinted at its origins. Inside, the pages were thick and yellowed, covered in crude drawings and what appeared to be a twisted form of hieroglyphics. But interleaved between these symbols were surprisingly legible passages, written in a spidery ancient script. The leader's gaze swept over their terrified faces as if savoring their rising dread. "Read it," he commanded, his single eye glinting with malicious amusement. "It tells you everything: the days, the purification, the sacrifice, the feast." With that, the cannibal leader turned and, with a series of low growls and clicks, motioned to his grotesque brethren. The cannibals, with another chorus of their unsettling cackles, began to withdraw deeper into the cavern, their torchlights flickering and fading until the only illumination came from a handful of small distant fires. The damp, foul air of the cave pressed in on them, and the sounds of the Ozark night, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal cries, seemed to mock their predicament. Silence descended, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the shallow, ragged breaths of the captives. The full horror of their situation, amplified by the chilling gesture of the book, crashed down on them. The white robes, the ritualistic cleaning, the methodical unveiling of their fate. It was all part of a monstrous, elaborate plan. Panic erupted. Sid let out a strangled cry, staring at the diminishing light. Steph whimpered, her earlier bravado utterly shattered. Ryan, who moments ago had been chugging beer, retched violently onto the cave floor. Sammy huddled into herself, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers. Mike, the bouncer, slammed his fist uselessly against the stone wall, a sound of impotent rage. Rhonda's face was a mask of pale horror, while Zach stared blankly into the shadows, his mind seemingly broken. Colin and Connor clung to each other, tears silently streaming down their faces. Jason's grizzled face was etched with a grim, knowing despair. Tristan's sketchbook lay forgotten, his eyes wide and vacant. Robert, the DJ, was shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering a macabre rhythm. Alex, clutching the grotesque book, found his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. But a morbid curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need to know, forced his gaze back to the horrifying text. His eyes scanned the first legible lines, and a cold, visceral dread settled deep in his bones. He read aloud, his voice trembling, barely a whisper in the echoing cavern. "If you have received this book, the purification has already taken place. Now you must sacrifice one of your own. This will keep you strong enough until we are prepared for the feast." 48 hours later, the hauntingly empty campsite. The afternoon sun beat down on the Ozark wilderness, intensifying the humidity and the buzzing of insects. Sheriff Brody, looking even more haggard than usual, surveyed the campsite again. This wasn't his first trip out here, but the scene remained stubbornly the same, a chilling tableau of abandonment. It had been 48 hours since the Meta Horizons bar staff were reported missing. The initial welfare check had escalated quickly. "Still nothing, Sheriff," Deputy Miller reported, swatting at a persistent fly. His enthusiasm from 2 days prior had been replaced by a palpable unease. No signs of struggle, no overturned tents, just like they packed up and left without a trace. Except they didn't. The collapsible tent, still imprinted with its death metal band logo, was now sagging more severely, a dew-stained relic. The artisanal cocktail cooler sat open, its ice long melted, the expensive spirits now lukewarm and useless. The faint, metallic tang that Brody had noticed before seemed stronger now, mingling with the heavy scent of decay from the deeper woods. "Check the ground again, Miller." "Every inch," Brody instructed, his voice low and strained. He was on his hands and knees near the cold fire pit, examining the damp earth with a magnifying glass. The strange, uniform drag marks he'd observed before were still there, fainter now after 2 days of sun and shifting leaves, but undeniably present. They led away from the camp, deeper into the tangled undergrowth. Brody found it again, Another straw sandal, identical to the first, tucked beneath a clump of wild ferns. This one was even cleaner, almost pristine on its white strap, as if placed there deliberately. He felt a shiver trace its way down his spine. No normal campers wore these. Then his gaze fell upon something else, partially buried in the loose earth near where Robert's broken speaker had been discovered. It was a patch of dark, stiff fabric. He carefully dug it out. It was a piece of denim, likely from a pair of jeans, but it wasn't just dirty. It was stained with a dark, almost black substance, and it had been torn with incredible force, the edges ragged and uneven. A fresh, metallic scent, unmistakable now, wafted up from the fabric. "Sheriff," Miller called out, his voice tight. "You're going to want to see this." Miller was kneeling by the creek, near a shallow eddy. The water, usually clear, had a faint, iridescent sheen to it, almost oily. And snagged on a submerged branch, gently swaying with the current, was a long, dark clump of human hair, thick and coarse, tangled with what looked like small, dried fragments of leaves and twigs. It looked like it had been violently ripped from a scalp. Brody rose slowly, the scrap of denim clutched in his hand, his eyes meeting Miller's. The serene beauty of the Ozarks had become a monstrous, silent witness. They weren't dealing with a simple missing persons case. They were dealing with a hunt, and the hunters were still out there. Beyond the disturbing personal items, Brody's keen eye also picked up on subtle anomalies. A series of small, almost invisible snares, expertly hidden, lay around the periphery of the camp, clearly designed to trip or trap small animals, or unwary humans. Further back in the woods, he noticed freshly broken branches and crushed undergrowth forming a faint, irregular path, too deliberate for animals, but not quite a human trail. The only plausible explanation was that whatever took the Meta-Horizon staff had moved with an unnatural, almost predatory efficiency. Their first lead would be to follow those faint drag marks and the barely perceptible trail, hoping it led to something more than just more questions. Day 3. The Captive's Desperate Pact. 3 days. 3 agonizing cycles of oppressive darkness and dim, torchlit uncertainty. In the reeking, bone-strewn cavern, the 12 staff members, clad in their absurd white robes, felt the weight of the cannibal's grotesque book pressing down on them. The first line: "If you have received this book, the purification has already taken place. Now you must sacrifice one of your own. This will keep you strong enough until we are prepared for the feast," echoed endlessly in their minds. They hadn't made a choice. The idea of sacrificing one of their own, of deciding who lived and who died, was a horror almost as great as their captivity itself. Every attempt to discuss it had devolved into frantic accusations, desperate pleas, or paralyzed silence. Yet, the gnawing hunger in their bellies, kept at bay only by the meager, unappetizing portions of what they desperately hoped were just beans and water, served twice a day by a silent, watchful cannibal, was a constant reminder of their ticking clock. The beans were gritty, lukewarm, and tasted faintly metallic, leaving them with an unsettling aftertaste and churning stomachs. Was it real sustenance, or just another part of the depraved ritual? They had been left largely alone since the first night, a calculated cruelty designed to let the terror of their situation fester and turn them against each other. The cannibals only appeared to drop off the meager rations, their eyes glinting with a horrifying patience. But the fear, while potent, had begun to curdle into something else: desperation. And with desperation came a flicker of something resembling resolve. Late on the third night, huddled together in the deepest part of the cave, away from the distant torchlight of their captors, a hushed conversation began. "We can't just wait," whispered Steph, her voice raw. Her usual vivacity was gone, replaced by a gaunt pallor. Mike, ever the protector, grunted, his powerful frame a stark contrast to his shaking hands. "They want us to break each other. We won't." Sid, surprisingly, was the one who took charge. His perpetual boredom had been replaced by a grim pragmatism. Okay, no sacrifice. We agree on that. So, we escape. How? Alex, the quiet bartender, had been the one poring over the grotesque book when no one was looking, his mind trying to find logic in the madness. The book? It mentions preparation. They don't want us weakened or sick before the feast. That's why the purification. That's why the food, no matter how disgusting. Jason, the cook, nodded, his eyes scanning the cave's rough walls. They leave us alone for hours. They're confident. That's our weakness and our opportunity. Rhonda, always sharp, pointed to a small, almost imperceptible crack in the cave wall, partially obscured by a dangling rib cage. I've been watching that crack. It expands a little when the wind blows through. If we could widen it. Tristan, the quiet artist, who had been sketching furiously in his notebook, held up a crude map of the cavern he'd been meticulously drawing from memory. The guards. They station themselves at that main entrance, and then there's another tunnel, less guarded, over here. He pointed with a charcoal-stained finger. It seems to lead to a more open area, maybe closer to the surface. Colin and Connor, though still terrified, piped up. We saw a drip over there near the smaller tunnel. It was clean water, not like the shower. A fragile spark of hope ignited amidst the pervasive despair. They were still deeply afraid, still starving, still violated. But the idea of escape, of defying their monstrous captors, was a powerful, unifying force. The unspoken agreement was made. They would work together. They would not offer a sacrifice. They would fight for their lives. Their first step was to examine the crack Rhonda found. The obstacle was immediate. It was too small for anyone to fit through, and the rock around it was incredibly tough. They needed a tool, something strong enough to chip away at the stubborn stone. Chapter 4. The Desperate Tools. Days bled into a nightmare blur. Alex, the quietest, had become their morbid oracle, translating chilling snippets from the grimoire of flesh that he studied in the dim light. It spoke of cycles, of a maturation period for the offerings, hinting at the grotesque timeline they were on. Each night, as their captors retired to their own deeper recesses, the prisoners began their desperate work. Their first attempt at a tool was rudimentary. Mike, with his bouncer's strength, tried to pry at the crack with a jagged bone he'd surreptitiously pulled from the floor. It snapped. Jason, the cook, suggested using the sharp edges of broken pottery shards from their meal bowls, but they were too brittle. Despair began to set in, a cold, creeping fog. Then Sammy, the youngest and most overlooked, had an idea. "The cleaver," she whispered, her eyes darting towards the cannibal leader's crude workstation, visible in the distance. It was always left propped against the bloody block, a constant, sickening reminder. "He leaves it there. If we could get it..." The idea was insane, suicidal even, but the desperation fueled them. Their plan was born of pure terror and slim chance. When the next meager meal was delivered, they acted. As the lumbering cannibal placed the bowls, Ryan, with a sudden, feigned coughing fit, created a distraction. Zach, feigning a trip, stumbled, kicking a bowl of the vile beans directly into the path of the approaching cannibal. As the creature grunted in annoyance, momentarily distracted, Alex, with a burst of adrenaline, darted forward. His hand shot out, snatched the cleaver, and he was back amongst the group before the lumbering figure even registered the loss. The cleaver was heavy, cold, and coated in dried blood. It reeked of death, but it was their only hope. Under the constant fear of discovery, they began to chip at the crack. Sid, Mike, and Jason took turns, grunting with effort, their muscles aching. Steph, Rhonda, and Sammy carefully cleared away the falling debris. Colin and Connor, surprisingly nimble, squeezed into the narrowest parts of the widening crack, pulling out loosened stones. Tristan continued to sketch, but now his drawings were focused on the cave's structure, potential weaknesses, and escape routes. Robert, though still trembling, tried to boost morale with hushed, dark humor. a grim echo of his DJ persona. Days passed. The crack became a fissure, then a narrow tunnel. They found the source of the clean water Tristan and Colin had noticed, a small cold spring trickling from a higher chamber. It was a lifeline, offering a taste of purity in their putrid prison. But their escape was a race against time. The leader's watchful eye seemed to linger longer on them each day. The ritualistic purification baths became more frequent, and the hunger intensified, as if their captors were subtly altering their diets to ready them for the ultimate consumption. One evening, as they toiled, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the rock. It was a sound they hadn't heard before, a low, guttural chanting that seemed to emanate from deeper within the cannibal's domain. Alex, his face pale, consulted the grimoire. "It's the calling of the great hunger," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The final preparations. The feast is soon." The urgency became unbearable. This was their last chance. Chapter 5. The Brutal Breakout. The calling continued, a chilling, rhythmic thrumming that shook the cavern and their resolve. It was now or never. Under the cover of the constant chanting, they made their move. Mike went first, using his immense strength to finally dislodge the last major boulder blocking their improvised tunnel. It crashed to the cave floor with a muffled thud, startling them all. Fresh, cool air, smelling of pine and damp earth, rushed in. Freedom. "Go!" Sid hissed, pushing Sammy forward. Sammy, small and agile, squeezed through the narrow opening first. Then Colin and Connor, hand in hand, slipped through. Next was Steph, followed by Rhonda, their eyes wide with desperate hope. As Zach began to pull himself through, a shadow detached itself from the deeper part of the main cavern. One of the cannibals. It had heard the thud. A guttural roar ripped through the air, cutting through the chanting. The escape was discovered. Chaos erupted. Mike, still inside, tried to block the opening. Jason lunged, wielding the stolen cleaver with unexpected ferocity, striking at the approaching cannibal. The creature roared, a sound of pain and rage, as the blade bit deep. But it was only one. Others were coming, their cackling rising in a terrifying crescendo. Jason was the first. As he turned to push Tristan into the opening, the large, one-eyed leader appeared from the main cavern, his own monstrous cleaver raised high. It descended with sickening force. Jason crumpled, a choked cry escaping his lips, his lifeblood pooling quickly on the grimy cave floor. His sacrifice bought them precious seconds. Robert, seeing Jason fall, screamed and tried to scramble back, but a smaller, quicker cannibal was upon him. He was dragged away, his pleas choked off by a crushing grip, his limbs flailing as he vanished into the deeper shadows. The sound of a sickening crack echoed, then silence. Ryan, fueled by terror, burst through the opening, but not before a crudely thrown spear from another cannibal found its mark, piercing his back. He stumbled, falling out into the open air, gasping, his life draining quickly onto the forest floor. He twitched once, then was still. Mike, still holding the opening, faced the one-eyed leader. There was a desperate, primal battle, grunts and roars echoing as the bouncer fought with surprising ferocity. But the cannibal was larger, more brutal, and armed with a sharper blade. Mike's struggles grew weaker, and with a final heartbreaking gasp, he was overcome, dragged back into the darkness. Now, only Alex, Steph, Rhonda, Sammy, Colin, Connor, Tristan, and Zach remained outside the tunnel. But the sounds of pursuit were closer. Chapter 6. The Forest of Horrors. They burst out into the moonlit Ozark forest, panting, disoriented, clad in their stark white robes. The air was cool, but the terror was hotter than any campfire. Behind them, the sounds of the cannibals, the guttural cackling and heavy footsteps were closing in. "Which way?" Steph gasped, clutching her side. "The creek!" Alex yelled, remembering Tristan's map. "It flows out. We follow the water." They stumbled through the dense undergrowth, branches tearing at their robes and skin. Sammy, Colin, and Connor, being the lightest, were surprisingly fast, fueled by raw adrenaline. Tristan, however, tripped over a gnarled root, twisting his ankle with a sharp cry. Before anyone could reach him, a massive, shadowy figure launched itself from the trees. Tristan barely had time to look up, his artistic eyes widening in a final, horrified realization before he was taken. A brief, wet, tearing sound was all that remained. "Keep going," Rhonda shrieked, pulling Zack by the arm. Zack, still in a daze of terror, was stumbling, his movements uncoordinated. They reached the creek, its shallow waters gleaming in the moonlight. Splashing through it was agonizingly slow, the slick rocks treacherous. As they waded deeper, another cannibal, a lean, quick one, burst from the tree line downstream, cutting off their path. It moved with terrifying speed. Zack, unable to react, tripped and fell in the water. The cannibal was on him in an instant, a flurry of motion, and then the water around Zack blossomed with a horrifying crimson cloud. He thrashed, then went limp, dragged beneath the surface. Now only Alex, Steph, Rhonda, Sammy, Colin, and Connor remained. They were losing people too fast. The forest seemed alive with predators. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, a potential killer. "We need to split up," Alex roared, a desperate last-ditch effort. "Diversion!" Someone runs, the rest hide. Before anyone could argue, Steph, surprisingly, made the choice. "I'll go. I'm fast." With a gut-wrenching cry, she veered off from the creek, crashing through the undergrowth, drawing the attention of the cannibals hot on their heels. Her screams faded into the night, a chilling testament to her sacrifice. Alex grabbed Rhonda. "Sammy, Colin, Connor, up that ridge. Find high ground." The three youngest obeyed, scrambling up a steep, rocky incline. Alex and Rhonda tried to follow, but as they pulled themselves up, a figure emerged from the shadows above. It was the cannibal with the necklace of ears. He dropped onto Rhonda from above, a heavy, brutal impact. Rhonda let out a choked gasp, a sickening crunch, and then fell back, unmoving, her body sliding down the rocks into the water below. Alex, reeling from the sudden horror, stared, paralyzed. He was alone with the three youngest, and the cannibals were still coming. Chapter 7. The Sole Survivor. Alex could hear the triumphant cackling drawing closer. He scrambled up the ridge, joining Sammy, Colin, and Connor, who were huddled together, sobbing, near a small, rocky overhang. The cold, clean water from their previous prison seemed a distant, mocking memory. "We have to keep moving," Alex whispered, his voice hoarse, but fear was calcifying their limbs. He could see the gleam of distant torchlight, hear the heavy footsteps. They were being cornered. Suddenly, a terrifying roar erupted from behind them. It was the one-eyed leader, his massive frame appearing at the base of the ridge, his cleaver glinting. He began to scramble up, surprisingly agile. "Run! Run and hide!" Alex screamed, shoving Sammy forward. Colin and Connor, paralyzed by terror, stayed rooted. They embraced each other, trembling, as the one-eyed leader reached them. His cackling filled the air, a final, horrifying lullaby. The last thing Sammy saw, before Alex's shove sent her stumbling away and she turned to bolt, was the swift, brutal arc of the cannibal's cleaver against the moonlit sky. Their desperate screams were abruptly cut short. Sammy ran, not caring where, just away. She could hear the triumphant, guttural roars echoing through the trees, celebrating their gruesome victory. She crashed through thorny bushes, tripped over roots, her white robe a beacon in the darkness, a target. She knew they were close behind her. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs felt like lead. She could no longer hear the cackling, only the pounding of her own heart. She collapsed, gasping, in a thicket, the smell of decaying leaves filling her nostrils. She tried to quiet her ragged breathing, listening. Silence. Number, not silence. The faint sound of trickling water. She forced herself to crawl forward. She found herself at the edge of a small, hidden stream, barely a trickle. The water was clear, cold, and clean. She plunged her face into it, drinking desperately, trying to wash away the taste of fear, and the metallic tang that seemed to linger in her mouth. She lay there for a long time, shivering, tears mixing with the creek water on her face. She was alone, utterly alone. 12 of them. Now, just her. As the first faint streaks of dawn began to paint the sky, Sammy, battered and broken, dragged herself to her feet. Her white robe was torn and stained, no longer a symbol of ritualistic preparation, but a shroud of survival. She looked back towards the direction of the cave, towards the unspeakable horrors she had witnessed, towards the gruesome end of her friends. She was the only one left, the final girl in this horrific Ozark nightmare. She would carry their screams with her, a horrifying echo in the otherwise quiet wilderness. She had to keep moving. She had to find civilization. She had to tell someone. But who would believe her? The sun rose, revealing the ordinary beauty of the Ozarks, a beauty that now felt utterly defiled. Sammy, the newest hire from Meta Horizons, walked on, a ghost in a blood-soaked robe, carrying a story no one should ever have to tell. Chapter 8. The Discovery. Sammy stumbled through the dense Ozark woods for what felt like an eternity, powered by a raw, desperate will to survive. Her body screamed in protest with every step, bruised and scratched from the chaotic escape. Dehydration and hunger gnawed at her, and the shock of what she'd endured threatened to consume her mind. Her white robe, now a tattered, blood-flecked rag, clung to her trembling frame. She was on the brink, her vision blurring, the sounds of the forest fading in and out. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brody and Deputy Miller had been relentlessly following the faint trail from the abandoned campsite. The piece of torn denim and the human hair found by the creek had hardened Brody's resolve. This was no ordinary disappearance. They moved with grim determination, pushing deeper into the wilderness, far beyond what any normal hiker would attempt. It was Brody who spotted her first, a flicker of white against the green and brown of the undergrowth. Lying half submerged in a shallow, muddy creek bed, barely conscious, was a figure in a tattered white robe. Her skin was deathly pale, streaked with dirt and dried blood, her eyes barely slits. "Miller, over here!" Brody shouted, his voice laced with urgency. He rushed to her, his heart pounding. He gently rolled her over, seeing the face of a young woman no older than Sammy, the newest hire from Meta Horizons Bar. She was gaunt, shivering uncontrollably, and her breathing was shallow. Sammy's eyes fluttered open, meeting his. They were wide with a terror that went beyond exhaustion, a horror that Brody had only ever seen in the eyes of combat veterans. Her lips moved, forming a weak, guttural sound, but no words came out. She tried to point, her arm trembling violently, pointing back into the depths of the forest. Brody held her gently. "It's okay, kid. You're safe now. We got you." He glanced at Miller, a silent understanding passing between them. Sammy was alive, but barely, and the look in her eyes confirmed their worst fears. There was something monstrous lurking in the Ozarks, something that had taken the others. The hunt was far from over, but now they had a witness, a very fragile, very traumatized witness. Epilogue, 6 months later. Psychiatric evaluation. Note, date, January 2nd, 2026. Patient, Sammy, last name redacted. Diagnosis, severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, acute dissociative disorder, malnutrition, resolved. Current status. Patient remains largely non-verbal, communicating primarily through guttural sounds and panicked gestures when startled. She exhibits extreme hypervigilance and profound fear responses to sudden noises, darkness, and the scent of wood smoke. Night terrors are a persistent and violent occurrence, requiring nightly sedation. Patient frequently screams fragmented phrases such as robes, cleaver, and feast, though without coherence. Appetite is inconsistent. Treatment progress, minimal. Patient continues to show little engagement with therapy sessions. Pharmacological interventions are ongoing, but have not yielded significant breakthroughs in reducing her persistent terror or improving cognitive function. She spends much of her waking hours staring blankly, occasionally tracing patterns on her arms as if attempting to scrub herself clean. Continued hospitalization and intensive psychiatric care are recommended indefinitely. Prognosis remains guarded. The sterile white walls of the psychiatric hospital felt a world away from the blood-soaked earth of the Ozarks, yet for Sammy, the two places were horrifyingly intertwined. 6 months. 6 months since Sheriff Brody found her, weak and clinging to life, a ghost in a tattered white robe. A soft knock interrupted the quiet hum of the ward. Sammy flinched, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. The door opened slowly, revealing Sheriff Brody. He looked older, more tired than she remembered, the lines on his face deeper. He held a worn hat in his hands, twisting the brim. "Sammy," he said softly, his voice low and kind, a stark contrast to the horrors that filled her mind. He pulled a chair to the foot of her bed, respecting the distance she kept. "They found them." Sammy's eyes, wide and vacant for so long, flickered with a raw, agonizing spark of recognition. Friends," she rasped, the word a painful effort. Brody nodded, his gaze meeting hers with a deep sorrow. "Yes, all of them. We found the cave. Your friends, Sammy. We found their remains. And the book, the one you tried to tell us about." His voice caught, heavy with the grim details he'd seen. "It was exactly as you described. Grotesque. Horrific." He paused, letting the information sink in, knowing it was both a torment and, perhaps, a sliver of validation. Sammy watched him, her breathing quickening. "But the cannibals," Brody continued, his brow furrowing, a strange frustration in his tone. "We found their hideaway. It was abandoned, like they just walked away. There was no sign of them, no bodies, no trace. They just vanished, as if they were never there." Sammy's eyes, wide with a terror that transcended her catatonia, locked onto his. Her lower lip trembled and she began to rock, a low moan escaping her. She looked past him, past the sterile walls, into the darkness of her memory. The cackling, the feral eyes. They hadn't vanished. They were just waiting, waiting for the next feast of the ancestors. Brody watched her, his own hope of closure dissipating with every shuddering breath she took. He had found the truth, or at least the gruesome evidence of it. But the nightmare, for Sammy, was far from over. It had just begun.